Greg with Beyond Us Games, and this is part 1 of the awesome inventory system. Now, if you'd like to follow along in exactly what I'm doing here, I have this project that is starting from scratch, but all of the sprites and the player object have been created for you. It's available in the description down below for you to download for GameMaker Studio 2, and you can follow along with me there if you so desire. But with that, let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we're going to do is make an object. And we're going to name this obj inventory. And this object is going to manage our inventory system apart from the player. So it'll be separate. That way, if anything goes wrong, if we have any bugs, we know where to look. And this object is going to be persistent from room to room, so it will always be there. Now, to make sure that is the case, we need to click on persistent, which is right here. GameMaker Studio 1, it's the same kind of box, says persistent. Just make sure that is checked. And then while we are thinking about it, let's put it inside of our room. Doesn't matter where. I would put it inside, like in the top left corner or something like that. That way it's in your room. So with that, let's go ahead and put a create event inside of here. And we are going to set up a few variables. And these variables are actually going to be global variables. And we initialize that with the term global var. And that allows us to access these variables from anywhere without having to use an accessor saying like obj_player.inventory or something like that. So we can name these whatever we want. I'm going to name them player inventory and player inventory width. And I'm going to set up player inventory width equal to 5. And the reason I'm doing that is we are going to be using the width of this inventory system in several different places, and I want to be able to access that very easily. And if we use a variable like this, then all we have to do is come in here and change this number if we ever change the design of our inventory, instead of going around and finding every single 5 that relates to the width and then changing that in there. So this just makes it a lot easier in the long run, which is what I'm trying to design for, is a very flexible and dynamic inventory system that you can use in lots of different cases. Now, player inventory, we're going to use a function called dsGridCreate. And this is actually going to be our primary inventory, and the dsGrid system is what we're going to be using all of those built-in functions to manage it. So I'm going to middle click on this and I'm going to bring up the help menu because it is very helpful to understand what we're using. Now, DS stands for data structure, and that just means it is a way of holding data in a particular format that is kind of industry standard, so that we know the things that a grid can do. We know the things that a map can do, which is another type of DS. There are built-in functions, and if we go back to DS grids right here, you can see that all of these functions are related to DS grids. And so these are the functions that we are going to be using, things like dsGridSet and dsGridGet. We can actually access them through the normal array accessor, but we want to use these functions because we know what we're going to get and we know how they're going to work. So with that, let's talk about dsGrids and why we want to use them in the first place. So they are a 2D array that can be any size and obviously have a lot of functionality built in, but they can store any kind of data you throw at them. They can store sprites, strings, numbers, scripts, all of these things that we are going to want to be associated with each item in our inventory. This grid can hold. And we can sort through this array and find things that we need to through a couple of for loops that once we write once, we are good to go because we'll add them as a script and we can call them and add functionality that we want to our own inventory system. Now, I want to show you the inventory that we are going to be using throughout this series. It's going to look like this. So the orange numbers are computer counting, which is how we're going to access them, and the black numbers are for normal counting, but also how some of the functions, the dsGrid functions, actually return numbers, such as the height and the width. They return a height of 2, which is important to know because if we are counting computer style, we need to realize that a height of 2 is actually a height of 1 in the way that we need to know about it. Now, our items are going to have just 5 things of information about them. They're going to have a name, amount, description, sprite, and script. And they're going to be in this order, which is important because we are going to access things like the name and the amount when we need to sort through them, when we need to find a specific item. The name is going to be in the 0 slot. So when we reference the X position of 0, we know that that item is going to be the name of that item. And when we reference the 4th spot of the X axis, we are calling that script to be used. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and create our inventory. And it's actually very simple because we just need to give it a width and a height. And we already have a width, which we have predefined here, and a height of 1 because we want it to have a height, but there's no actual items inside of it. So again, this is counting from 1. So this is just going to be one item of 1 height inside of our DS grid. There's nothing in it now, but we are going to put something in it, and then I'm going to show you that this is actually working. Now, to add items, we need to create our own script. Because we are going to add it, like I showed you, in the way and in that specific format for our items. So we're going to call this add item, and this is actually going to be a very generalized script in the sense that you are going to be able to use this anytime throughout your games. When you want to add an item from the end of a fight, all you have to do is grab the item that it is and call this script, pass in the right information, and it will add an item to the inventory. If you are buying an item from a merchant, if you pick up an item from a ground, this script will be functional for all of those cases, which is very useful. Now, I'm going to copy and paste something in here, which you may have seen, you may not have seen. This is JSON comments, and it allows our custom-made functions, our scripts, to behave and look a little more like GameMaker Studio functions. With these in here, I've added the function name, a description, and also the arguments that we are going to be passing in. So if I come up here and I actually type in add item, it changes color because I have changed the predefined color for my scripts. That way I can see them easier. But then you can also look right down here that it now tells me, like a GameMaker Studio built-in function, what I need to add in. I need to pass in a DS grid, and it's going to be called grid. The grid to add is what I need to put in there, which is going to be player inventory. So I need to pass in a string and an item name, and so on and so forth. Every time that you add this set of scripts, or set of comments, you can make a script look a lot more like a function. And you can find that in the help manual, which is where I found it. So what we're going to do is we're going to set these up. We're going to say grid to add to equals argument 0. We're going to say new item name equals argument 1. New item amount equals argument 2. New item description equals argument 3. New item sprite equals argument 4. And then new item script equals argument 5. Okay, now we need to think about a couple of cases here. So when we are designing a script, we need it to work under any circumstances. And for adding an item, we need to think about 2 cases. So case 1, item is already in the inventory. And then case 2, it's not in the inventory. So for case 1, depending on how you want to handle it, we are going to handle it as if we already have the item in the inventory, we are going to increase the amount that it is, because you can hold as many items as you want here. Now, of course, you can add in like a weight category, and then you can have all sorts of different information about your inventory if you want specifically. But in our case, we're just going to say, if we have an item already, just increase the amount. If not, then we are going to add the item to the inventory. So to increase the amount, what we need to do is have a special case. So we are going to check to see if that is already in there. We're going to check through a for loop. And we are going to be using for loops a lot throughout this series. So if you don't know how to use them, I suggest you figure that out. I have a couple videos on them, GameMaker language and so forth. But if not, I'm going to try to explain them here as best I can. A for loop, well actually, let me show you a little thing. You can actually what is that? I just found this. F4, and if you click 4, you have a predefined for loop that it sets up for you. Now, these words are kind of big, but basically, you need to initialize a variable that is going to be changed every time the loop is run. So I'm going to say I equals 0. So it's just a variable called I that I'm setting up right now, and it is going to start at 0. And it's starting at 0 because our inventory starts counting at 0. The condition is while I is less than ds grid height grid to add to. So while it is less than the height of our grid to add to, and while it is less, it is going to then go through this entire statement here. All of the code inside of these brackets will then be run while this is less than that. When it comes to the end of this statement, it is then going to increment it. And we are going to say plus plus I, which just means I equals I plus 1. It's the exact same thing. It's just that plus plus I is a shorthand for it, and it's the way that I learned to code, so maybe it's the way you learn to code. So our statement here is going to look like this. We're going to say if ds grid get grid to add to, you have to pass in the ID of the grid on all of these functions you want to use so it knows which information to grab. So if we're going to grab the information on 0, which is the name, and I, which is the item slot, because we're going to go through our inventory and look at every single item. And if the information returned from this function, which can either be a real or a string, if it is returned and it equals new item name, then what we want to do is just increase the amount that item is there because it's already there. So if this returns true, it means that we found the item in the inventory. So then we're going to say ds grid set grid to add to, and this is going to be 1. So we're going to set the value of 1 and I, so the spot we're at, but the amount value we're going to change. And the amount we're going to change it is by the new item amount right here. But we have to get that value beforehand because we can't just assume that they only have 1, because sometimes if it's like gold, they could have a lot more. And if they picked up 5 gold, we need to add 5 to however much they had before. And to do that, we use their function called dsGridGet. So we get the amount they already have and then add our new amount to that. So grid to add to, and it is going to be 1 and I for exactly where we are. It's going to be plus new item amount. And then we are going to return true. And this is just for if anything goes wrong, we can set up a return false, and then we'll know that something failed along the way. So that is the case if we find anything. So if we find the item, we're just going to increase the amount, and we'll call it good. We don't need to do anything else. But most of the time, we're not going to find it, and we actually are going to want to do this second case. And it will look like this. So let me bring this up. So if dsGridGet grid to add to 0 and 0, we're going to say if it doesn't equal 0. So this is simply a check. And this check is saying that if the grid is empty, then we don't need to do this. But if the grid isn't empty, if the first slot in the inventory it has an item already, then we are going to increase the size of the grid. But if the first item in the inventory is 0, which zeros would mean that there's nothing in it, which right now there is nothing in it. When we create a grid, it fills all of those slots up with zeros, which is how we know that there's nothing in there. So there is 5 zeros right now in our DS grid. So we are checking to see if the grid, if our inventory is completely empty, and the way we know that is through zeros. So we're checking to see if it doesn't equal to 0, because if it does, we can just put an item in that slot. Does that make sense? I'm hoping that this makes sense. If our inventory is not empty, what we're going to do is dsGrid resize. We are going to increase the size of our grid by 1, grid to add to, and the width is player inventory width, and the new height is actually going to be dsGrid height, grid to add to, plus 1. So if our grid is empty, that means that the name of the first item will be 0. And if that's the case, we are then just going to add in the next set here. But if it's not empty, if there's already an item there, then we want to increase the grid size. This is a safety check because when I was making this, I found that if you just resize the grid every single time, because we're starting the grid at 1 size, it does a funny thing. So just make sure you have this in here. Now what we want to do is say new item spot equals dsGrid height. And this is going to be grid to add to, as usual. But now it's going to be -1, because we want the spot that is below what it actually returns. Because remember, the dsGrid height will return a size of 2, and if we're counting in computer, which is how we're going to assign it, 0, 1, 2 is actually the third spot. So we need to subtract 1 from whatever this returns in this circumstance. And so now what we're going to do is just use the function dsGrid set and set all of the values in our new blank inventory spot to the values that we have passed in. So it's going to look like this. We're going to say grid to add to, 0, new item spot. That's why we did that, so that we don't have to put this function in there every single time. And new item name. So what am I going to do right here is actually copy this and paste it. Now, be careful, because we need to change these numbers right here to 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we need to change what we're putting in there as well. So this needs to be new item amount, new item description, new item sprite, and new item script. But with that, that actually lets us add all of the values that we are passing in into the correct spots. And we have to do that a lot, but now it is a script. It's a function that we can call very easily, very quickly, and it will just work every single time. So even though we had to kind of copy and paste this code a lot, we just had to do it once. That's it. So now we have a working script to add items to actually any inventory, any grid we can actually add items to, and it will do it perfectly because we have set it up that way. Now, to show you this, we're going to make obj pickup, and we're going to do this so that I can show you in kind of a graphical, visual way so that you can actually see it working. So we're going to not give it a sprite because we're going to assign it a sprite, and the way we're going to do that is come into our create event. So set up default values, and now inside of here we're actually going to say my item name is equal to undefined, my item amount equals undefined, my item description equals undefined, and my item sprite undefined, my item script undefined. So what we're going to do is when we create these items inside of wherever, we are going to set all of these values so that they can be dynamically created at will instead of having a set of items for all of them. Right now, I just have these sprites, but in a big game, you'd probably have way more items than this. Using just one item and through this method, you can have all of the items in your game as pickup objects with just one object right here. And the way that you can do that is by adding the draw event. And inside of draw, we're going to assign sprite index equal to my item sprite. We're going to draw self, which is very important, otherwise it will not appear. And then we are going to add a collision event with our player. And inside of here, we are going to call the function add item. And we want to pass in the player inventory. and then the item name is my item name, my item amount, and you can kind of see where we're going from here. We're just going to pass in those values that we just set up. My item description, my item sprite, and my item script. And then we're going to call instance destroy on ourselves, because as soon as we pick up that item, we no longer want to have that item in the room. So inside of here, we're going to pass in 3 items, and it doesn't really matter what, but if we double click on it and click on creation code, we can then set this up. So to make sure that we got this all correct, I'm going to copy this section into here, and inside of our creation code, I'm just going to copy and paste that, and then I'm going to set these for whatever we want. So this is going to be a red berry. My item amount will be 1. Description will be a delicious red berry. My item sprite is SPR red berry. And item script right now is just going to be nothing, because we don't have anything to give it a script. Eventually, if this was a healing item, we might have a healing script. We can pass in how much it would heal, and so on and so forth, but right now we don't. So let me just go ahead and paste that one more time. Give it another name. We'll call this one sword. My item amount of 1. Description is a metal sword. Duh. My item sprite is SPR sword. And item script, again, will be blank. And then I'm not going to set this third one so that you can kind of see exactly what happens. Now, if we run this, 2 of those items will show up. The third one is going to be like that, because the very first sprite in here is actually my SPR Bard walk up, and it picks up undefined kind of as a, well, when it assigns sprite index inside of the object pickup, it does it with the very first one that comes into contact with, and so it looks kind of funny. But if you ever see like the very first sprite show up in your inventory somewhere, that's what's happening, is it is pulling the very first value of your sprite. But now if I collect this, well, nothing happens. It doesn't look like anything happens, but it does. So I'm going to press F6 to open up the debugger, and I am going to set global variables to true. I'm going to pull this up, and I am going to right-click after I pause. I'm going to right-click on this player inventory and set it to DS grid. And now, right here, you can see that it has a width of 5 and a height of 1. Now, if we play this, and I move around and I pick up a berry, it's going to then add that berry and keep the height of 1 because the was empty the first time. And if I come over here and pick up a sword, it is now a height of 2, red berry, and a sword. So that is a fully working inventory to be able to add items to it. What happens if we do that? We pick up an undefined item. So that's kind of funny. But that is our inventory system, at least the very basics of it. So creating an inventory is actually super simple. If you're using DS grids, most of the functions are already there. They are created for you, and all you have to do is utilize them. You can see it here in the debugger. With just that one script that we made, we can add items to our inventory in the correct amount and where they should go. And so let's get on that and start working on the GUI for our inventory. First thing we need to do is make a new object that is going to take care of all of that displaying information. We're going to call this obj inventory GUI, GUI, graphical user interface. We're going to assign it the sprite, SPR fantasy inventory sprite, lengthy name, I know. And then we are going to add a create event. So inside of here, we're going to set up all of the variables, all of the data that we need to properly display our inventory as we register and as we grow this object. So first thing we need is text border. This text border is going to specifically apply to this sprite in the sense that right here it has a little bit of a border. You can see it has a little bit of gray and then brown, and I want to display the text right here on this light gray parchment-like paper. That's what our border is going to allow us to do. So if you change the sprite, you'll need to change this value as well. We're going to set my items equal to player inventory. And this is just so that this name is a little bit shorter because we're going to use it a lot. We're going to set my color equal to C black, which is just going to be the text color that is displayed. We're going to say is empty equal to false. And this is going to be so that if we have no items in our inventory, we then display an empty message, which is you've no items. Okay? Now we're going to set up some global variables. These variables are going to be accessed in different scripts and different objects that our obj inventory GUI will create, so we want to be able to access them easily and quickly. So that's going to be item selected, scrolled amount, and inventory end at. So let me go ahead and increase this window so we can see. Okay, so first off, item selected is going to equal 0. So this is going to be the item that we are currently chosen on our inventory list. We're going to have scrolled amount equal to 0. We'll get to that eventually. And inventory end at is going to be a couple of different things that it can choose from. It's going to use this function called min, which stands for minimum. So it's going to pass in several different values and then return the smallest of those. So we're going to pass in the DS grid height of my items. And this is specifically so that when we choose to display how many items on the inventory GUI, we're going to choose the either the amount of items we have in our inventory, which can range from 0 to 22,000, I think the array size is in here. Maybe it's 220,000. I don't know. It's something ginormous. Or we're going to display the maximum of our sprite height. And the way we get that is by using the function floor, which is just rounding down. 2 parentheses here because we need to do some math in the right order. We're going to get sprite height minus text border times 3. So that times 3 is specifically so that it fits exactly how we want and doesn't display items outside of the sprite. 2 parentheses at the end of that 3, and divide by 32 with 2 parentheses at the end of that as well. This math needs to be done in the correct order. You need to multiply this, and then subtract it, and then divide the value. So if you have any weird display issues, it's probably from that right there, because you need to make sure the math is done properly. Another value we need to have on here is inventory on screen, and that's going to start at 0 as well. And then we're going to set the is empty message and inventory end at in a special case. So we're going to say if ds grid get my items of 0, 0, which is the first item name in our list, if that's equal to 0, that means we know that it is empty. So we actually want to display nothing on screen, and we want to show our is empty message. So that will equal to true. Okay? Now that sets it all up. We're not going to use all of these values in this part, but we will in the coming parts. The next big thing that we need to do, though, is actually be able to display our inventory. We have the object, but to bring it up, we're going to add a key press of the letter I, and this is inside of obj inventory, okay? So create the inventory on screen. So if the inventory is not on the screen, then we want to make it. But if it is already on the screen, we want to destroy it. The way we're going to check that is through an if statement. So if instance doesn't exist, and we're going to use the exclamation point, which is not, and then the function instance exists, obj inventory GUI. So if this does not exist, we want to make it. So we're going to say inventory display equals instance create. Now, this function right here will work in GameMaker Studio 1. It will not work in GameMaker Studio 2. If you're following along in 1, then just use that, but know that you will need to separately set the depth of the object being made so that it is lower than whatever is making it, so that it is always on top of the screen. For GameMaker Studio 2, we need to use the function depth, and we actually set the depth when we make it. So we're going to create this at 0, 0, because we're going to set the x and y later in just a second. This is going to be depth minus 1, and we're going to make obj inventory GUI. Now the reason we've given it a name is that we are going to come down here and say with inventory display, and this is where you'd set the depth if you're in GameMaker Studio 1.4. We're going to set the X and the Y coordinates because we want to set it based on the sprite that is being displayed for our OBJ inventory GUI, and before this is made, we don't know what it is. I could get the information from this right here, but perhaps you've changed the sprite you want to draw, and this will allow you to change that sprite and still have it be in the correct spot, which is the bottom left corner for this specifically. So we're going to use the function sprite get x offset of the sprite index, and the sprite index is with the object we just created. So it's the sprite index that is assigned to OBJ inventory GUI. And y is going to equal room height minus sprite get y offset of our sprite index. So if I press F5 and run this, we are going to be able to create our OBJ inventory GUI and place it directly in this bottom left corner. By doing that through this functions right here, we are dynamically setting the correct position no matter what the sprite actually ends up being. It is going to take the room height and the X and Y offset, which is set right here inside of the sprite editor window. If I change it, you can see here that then it would display differently, but I keep mine at middle center all the time. That way it makes it exactly where we need to. Now the last thing I want to do right here is say else. So if it already exists, then we want to destroy it. Now in GameMaker Studio 1, you can't do this. OBJ inventory GUI. You'll need to use another with statement and then call it instance destroy on itself. But in GameMaker Studio 2, you can pass in objects to destroy themselves, which is super useful. Okay, that takes care of bringing up our inventory and destroying it. Now we want to actually focus on displaying something of our inventory. So we're going to add a draw event on screen. Now we're going to use the variables that we've set up and the information that we have to draw the names right now of the items that we have. So the first thing we want to do is draw self. If we don't draw self, then it will not show up at all. We're going to draw set color equal to my color. That way you can change that very easily. Now before we draw the names, we need to draw the headers or the column labels. So we're going to use draw text, and I have found the values specifically for my sprite here. So if you change it, again, this will need to be changed. And this took a lot of tinkering around. So if you can't find it at the first shot, don't be discouraged. Keep playing around with it. So we're going to say bbox left plus text border, bbox top plus text border, and this is going to say image. Now bbox left and top are actually the bounding boxes of the sprite that you are currently calling it in. So it returns the X value of the left and the Y value of the top. That way it's going to display right up here every single time, even if we change the size of this sprite. Very useful to use these built-in variables. That way if you change the sprite or the size, it will still function properly. So I'm going to copy this and paste it twice. We need to change the X values because we need to change where they're being drawn to 125 and 225. We need to change this to name and amount. And that will draw the image, name, and amount. So let me make sure we've got everything working properly here. I'm going to run it, press I, there's our column labels, and I can destroy it. Okay, that's working fine. Now, I'm going to create two more things here. I'm going to say item left start equals bbox left plus 120, and item top start equals bbox top plus 48. And that's just because we are going to be using these quite a bit inside of our drawing of the inventory, and I'm just going to make them easier to access. Now, let's draw our inventory. We're going to say for I equals 0, I is less than inventory end at plus I, and we are going to draw text, and it's going to be drawn at item left start, item top start, plus, in parentheses, I times 32. That way, as I increases, the Y position of the items that we're drawing are changing and going down further on the screen. And we want to draw the value of ds grid get my items. And this is going to be 0, which is the name, and I, which is the specific item that we are on. 2 parentheses, and then we are good to go. Now, right now, you cannot run into an item and have it added to the inventory while it's running. We'll get there eventually, but that's kind of like just a nice feature to have. But if we bring up the inventory again, because this is created every single time you make it, it is now there. If we come over here and pick up these 2 items, we now have a sword, a red berry, and an undefined item, which is awesome. So that gives us those things to be able to add to our inventory, showing that our add item is working. And now we can display those things where we want them, which is just awesome. And now we need to display everything else. So let's go ahead and start working on that right away. Now what we're going to do in here is add in a secondary for loop that is going to go through and gather all of the information about each item that we have selected. So we're going to say for j equals 0, and j is less than player, inventory width, which is the global variable that we set up, and it's going to increase by 1 each time. Ooh, wrong bracket. Now, the way you can envision this is that we need to take this one and actually add it right there. The way to envision this is that we need to go through every single index of the variable, of the inventory that we have. And if you remember, the 2D array looks like this. So we've got name over here, and then we have amount, and so on and so forth. So we need to have 2 for loops because we need to come down to the first item, then we need to go this way. And we need to go all the way through here, and then when we're done, we jump up 1 and go all the way through again, displaying all of the information, getting all the information that we need out of it. And to do that, we use 2 for loops. Now, to draw it correctly, we need to put in some if statements. So we're actually going to say if j is equal to 0, then we are going to draw the name exactly where we want it to. Because we need to draw things like the sprite image and the name in specific columns, we need to take control of that, and the way we do that is by checking to see which value j has, and if it's a specific value that we want, we draw it where we want it to go. So the next one is if j is equal to 1, that's the amount. So then we're going to draw text, and this will be item left start plus 140, item top start plus, again, I times 32, and then we need to get the amount, which is done through ds grid get, and this is going to be my items, 1, because that is where the amount is, I, which is the first for loop we're doing, which is taking care of the y-axis, the items in our list, and then we have our amount that we are drawing, which is perfect. Then we want to draw the sprite, and that's going to be if j is equal to 3, then we are going to draw sprite. And the sprite we want to draw is the first thing we need to give it. So we're going to say ds grid get my items, and the x and y position is going to be j, because the x position is j here in this double for loop, and then we have I being the actual y coordinate that we want, and that will get the sprite. And now we want the first image of it, which is the first sub image, and the x and y position for here needs to be b box left plus 40, item top start plus I times 32. Now we need to do one more addition here, plus 16. And that's because our sprite is actually 32 by 32, and we need to put that directly in the middle of where we are looking at. And adding the 16 will do that. Now, if I run this, our sprite and our amount should also show up for the items that we have in our inventory. So let's pick these up, and voila, we have our images and our amount. So with that, now we have our items being displayed from our inventory properly. So what we want to do is actually come back into our obj inventory, and I'm going to just throw in some items into our inventory to fill it up, to make sure that it is displaying properly and that we have a full inventory, so that when we start doing scrolling in the next part, we are going to have that ready to go. So I'm actually just going to copy that from mine, but I will pause for a second and I'll allow you to kind of create your own thing. So this is everything that I have right here. I'm just calling the add item script and filling it in with all of the sprites that I have, all of the items right here. So you can pause this and then you can do this yourself if you want, or you can download this project and copy it, or do really whatever you want. I took a long time to actually come up with the names and got the sprites right, so that is all there. Now, the things that might break really quick are right here, are functions that we have not created yet, so we'll take those out, and then we should be okay. Now, let's run this and check, because now that we filled it up, our initial if statement should show that we are only going to create that many items, even though we have like 15, 16 items in our inventory. So that works perfect. Now, what we want to do next is actually be able to show and select different items in our inventory. To do that, we're going to come back to obj inventory GUI, and we are going to come down here, and we're going to create a rectangle around the selected item, and then we are going to be able to move that rectangle, and we're going to show that we are actually looking at a specific item when we're doing that. So what we're going to do is use the function draw rectangle, and we need to provide 4 values of the x and y coordinates, and it's going to draw a rectangle around that, and then we decide if it is an outline or not. So the values that I am going to use, I have worked around and figured out exactly what I need for this inventory display. So it's going to be bbox left plus text border, item top start plus item selected times 32, and item selected is what we're going to use to change our selection. Bbox right minus text border, and then item top start plus item selected times 32, and then we're going to add 32 to this because we need to start it at 1 down, because we're adding the plus 32 because the border is basically, you know, we don't want it to start over the names here. We need it to start where it needs to begin. I'll show you that in just a second. We'll write true, and then if we press run and I pick up an item, the border is going to be around the first item selected. Okay, there we have it right there. So that plus 32 gets us in the correct spot for exactly where we need that y coordinate to be. Now we can't move it yet, so that's what we're going to do next. We're going to come up here, and we're going to add an event, and I'm actually going to use mouse wheel down and mouse wheel up. You can use any keyboard event you want here, or any event that you want, and what we're actually going to do is create 2 scripts that go up and down accordingly. So those scripts are going to be scroll down and scroll up, and then you can just call these scripts whenever you want to go up or go down inside of your inventory, which makes it very simple. So inside of down, what we want to do is say item selected, which is where we are choosing and where we're actually scrolling through our items. It's going to equal clamp, which is a function that takes a variable, and this time we're going to put item selected in here, and tells it to either, it can go this high or this low, and it won't let it go outside of those values. So this is a really handy function, because if you don't want a value to go beyond something, you can keep it clamped with this function. And we need this value to be clamped because we are going to be moving between items, and if we were to ever go outside of the grid and try to say select item 16 when there are only 15, it is going to throw an error and the game will crash. So we're going to clamp this value, and the way I use it is right here. So I'm going to try to increase it and then assign that increase to my variable, but I'm going to say that it can't go below 0 and that it can't go above ds grid height of my items, and it's going to be -1. Now, my items is only in obj inventory GUI, which is where we are going to be calling the script from, so that's totally fine. Now, if you were to change where you're calling it from, you might have an issue with my items. So we're going to go to scroll up and do basically the exact same thing, but in a reverse manner. So we're going to say item selected equals clamp minus item selected 0 and ds grid height my items -1. And then we are going to be able to move up and down our inventory once we put in these functions. So we're going to say on mouse wheel down, we're going to scroll down. And on mouse wheel up, we're going to scroll up. And so you can see that we can move this up and we can move it down. Right now we can go beyond the inventory, but we can't get an error because of that clamp that we've set up. So that's a really good start. Now what I want to do before we get into scrolling is to show you how to access the description of all of these items and actually display that. So right here underneath draw rectangle, once we get to the end of it, very long one, we're going to draw a sprite, and the sprite we're going to draw is just like a description box, and then we're going to get the description of the item, and then we're going to draw that inside of that box. So what we're going to do is say draw sprite SPR item box 0 subimage, and we're going to draw this of the BB box right of ours, where we are right now. We're going to get the X offset of the sprite item box, and then we're going to set it over room height minus sprite get Y offset SPR item box. So now we're going to draw that right there. And then what we want to do when we are drawing that, we want to draw the text of our item that we have selected. But if we don't have an item selected, we need to draw the is empty message. So we need to put that in right here. So instead of just always drawing the description, we need to have an if statement that says if is empty, draw text ext. Extended text just means that we can say if it exceeds our width limit, make it into multiple lines, which is very handy. This is going to be BB box right plus 50, room height minus sprite get Y offset of sprite item box. So again, that's a very useful function to be able to get. And we need to then subtract that by 100 to bring it into the right spot. And the text that we want to put in there is empty message. The separation is 32, and the width is actually the sprite get width. And this is the width of the sprite item box. That way it can't go beyond the item box. And then we need to subtract the text border that we have. That way it stays within the border of the inventory that we're drawing. Stays inside the text box that we're drawing. So if it is not empty, what we want to do is basically draw the exact same thing. So copy this, paste it right there. We're going to change the empty message to ds grid get, and the ID is going to be my items. The X position we know is 2 because that is the description, and the Y is the item selected. Close that, and then that's what it's going to draw. Now we want to change this first value to plus 15 just because it's going to be a little bit different, and when we draw the is empty message, we know what that's going to be, so we can change its spot. Now, if I press I, you can see here that I am drawing this text box, and we are drawing the descriptions of everything inside of here. So we can go all the way down. This doesn't move, but you can see that we are changing what we are looking at. And if we come into OBJ inventory, and I comment this whole line out, we can check the is empty message and make sure that it is working as well. So we've no items, but this still gets drawn, and that is just a designer thing. I want it there. If you don't, then you could probably just put that inside of the if is empty, then don't draw this, otherwise draw it. So I have it there, but you don't have to. And now we're going to uncomment this so we can start working on scrollable inventory. Then we're going to jump into the object inventory GUI. And inside of here, we're actually going to be using a variable that we've already made called scrolled amount right here. And we're going to be putting that inside of our draw event in certain locations. So the places that it needs to go are at the places where we are getting information from our grid, which is our DS grid get. And we're going to put a plus scrolled amount wherever that is happening. So there, on the second line, and on the third. Our scrolled amount value is going to make it so that the items that are being displayed are in line with how far down we've gone through our inventory and far up once we come back up. Now our rectangle that we are drawing needs to be changed just a little bit. Inside of these item selected ones, what we need to do is actually put a parentheses around them, and then we are going to subtract scrolled amount. Here we need to subtract it because we want our rectangle to always be on the bottom of our inventory instead of going below. So if we subtract how much we've scrolled down, it'll always be on the bottom instead of disappearing. And it's minus scrolled amount. Now, we've done that, but we haven't actually changed our scrolled amount at all. So what we need to do is open up our scroll functions. If you middle click on a script that you've created inside of your window here, it'll actually open it up right over here, which is kind of cool. So on our scrolled down, what we need to do now is update our scrolled amount based on certain values, because you don't just update it anytime. It needs to be specifically when you are going below what is there and what is displayed. So to do that, we're going to do an if statement. We're going to say if item selected is greater than or equal to inventory end at. And if this is true, we're going to do plus plus scrolled amount and plus plus inventory on screen. Now, what we need to check, oh, I keep doing that. The last thing down here we need to check is a special case. If we are attempting to go beyond the grid size, we need to put if scrolled amount, because this is going to be added to I. So if scrolled amount plus inventory on screen is greater than DS grid height of my items, this time we're not going to subtract 1 because we want it to only be greater than it. We're going to decrement our scrolled amount. And that way we can't go beyond our grid and end up with an error. Now what we also need to do is take this variable inventory on screen and actually do something with it. Right now we haven't done anything with it. It is just a value that we have. So what we're going to do is actually inside of our draw event, right underneath here, we are going to say inventory on screen is equal to I. This way we can know exactly what I is all the time, and we can be checking where we are and making sure that we're not going beyond where we should be. Now on our scroll up, we're going to do basically the same thing, but in reverse. So here, all we need to check is if item selected, if the item we've chosen is less than scrolled amount. Oof, I cannot type. We're going to decrement our scrolled amount. And with that, I'm actually going to build this, and we should see an inventory system that we can go down and we can scroll through. We can go all the way to the bottom, we can go up, and when we come up, it starts scrolling at the very top. And that is how I liked it and how I thought it should look. That's a pure design decision. If you want, you can change the if statements on the scrolling up to begin scrolling up at a different point if you want, but this is just the way I did it. So this is our full inventory, and now it is scrollable. You can view everything, which is awesome. So this is This is huge. This actually took me a very long time, so I hope you guys appreciate this and that you can use it in your games. So with that, we now have a scrollable inventory, but we can't use it. We can't do anything with this yet. So what we're going to do is actually make it now usable. So we're going to create a obj button. And this button is going to use this SPR button sprite. And this sprite actually has 2 subimages, so we're going to use those so that when we hover over it, it changes, just for a little bit of a nice effect. So inside of here, what we're going to do is add a create event, and we're going to set image speed equal to 0 since it has more than one subimage. And we're going to give it a variable that we are going to define when we create our sprite button. This is going to be something that we create, and then we give it information. Now the reason that this is an actual object instead of just a sprite like our sprite item box that we drew on screen is that we want to be able to click on it. Now if we want to click on something that isn't an object, it's far more difficult because we have to be precise on where our mouse is at, and tracking your mouse location based on a sprite you're drawing from code is possible. It's just a lot of work and it's a lot more difficult to get precise. So if we create an item, we can do much easier, much simpler things, such as a mouse event, like mouse enter, where we say image index equal 1, and a mouse event where it's mouse leave, and we say image index equals 0. That way when we go onto it, we can tell that we are hovering over it, and it just makes it a lot better. Okay, a lot easier. So draw, we're going to add an event, and inside of here, all we're going to do is just draw ourselves and draw the text that this object has been given. And it's going to be drawn at x minus 20 and y minus 10 to be right in the middle. And it's going to be my text. Now, the text that we're going to give it is going to be use and either discard or trash or remove, whatever kind of adjective you want to use to get rid of an item, you would give that to it. And then what we're going to do is a mouse left pressed, and when it is pressed, we're going to call a function that is trash item, which we haven't made yet, but we're going to set it up so that it is ready to go. So I'm going to say if my text is equal to use. And this part's important because this button is going to be used for both using and removing, so we need to have a check in here that says when we press on it, do something based on certain criteria, and that criteria is my text. So if it's used, what we're going to do is actually use the script that the object that we have currently selected has. So we're going to say if, actually we're going to say script execute ds grid get, and we're going to say player inventory. And 4 is where our description, or is where our script is being stored at. It's the very last thing in our inventory. So 4, and then item selected. And remember, that is a global variable from our obj inventory GUI. So we can access that, and that is on the item that we want. And then when we, oh, hold on, one more. So then when we use our script execute, that just says use the script that is inside of there, and we can store a script very easily, which is awesome, but you need to use this script execute function. Now, thinking about this, when we use an item, what we want to do is to use it, but then we want to get rid of that item because it has been used. So right after this, we actually want to call trash item, which hasn't been made. So let's go ahead and create that script, and we'll come through and we'll fill that in just a minute. But that way it is right here, so we know it's being used. Okay, and then we're going to say else if my text is equal to trash. We're going to just call trash item, not tash item. That way it just gets rid of the item completely. All right. So with that, we need to go into obj inventory GUI. Before we make that script actually official and doing something, we're going to go to the create event, because now we need to actually make those buttons and put them on screen so that they can be used. But to do that, I actually want to put them inside of an alarm. The reason for this is that I want to access certain variables about my obj inventory GUI that aren't actually set yet. And mainly that is the X and Y location of our obj inventory GUI. You may be thinking that it's already set because it appears in place, but if you remember, right here, when we create it, we actually make it at 0, 0. And yes, we change it, but it doesn't actually update the X and Y coordinates until the next frame. So it's going to come in here, it's going to create it, and it's going to set it, but it's not going to move it. So if we try to create our buttons based on where our sprite, where our object is, it's going to be incorrect. This is something that I found was very strange. I was trying to use bbox left, and it was coming up with -150, even though I had set it in the correct spot. And that was because it hadn't yet initialized and set the X and Y coordinates. So if we set alarm 0 to 1, it will then work because it has had time to update those events. Hopefully that makes sense. So inside of our alarm, we're actually going to create a couple of buttons. So use button is going to be instance create depth. Again, this is the difference between GameMaker Studio 1 and 2 is instance create depth. So you just need to use regular instance create. And I'm going to say bbox right plus 58. And again, these are values that I have played around with, and it took me a while to figure out, but they work very well for what I'm doing with this specific sprite. Room height minus sprite get Y offset SPR item box, because we want it to be exactly where the item box is being located. And then we're going to increase that by 100. And we're going to say depth minus 1, because we want it to be on top of it. And obj, what do we call that? Obj button. Okay? Now that will make it, and it's too large to fit on screen. And then what we want to do is assign my text to it. So use button dot my text equals use. Now we're going to do the same thing with trash button, instance create depth, and it's going to be pretty close, but it's going to be bbox right plus 198, and then it's going to be room height minus sprite get Y offset SPR item box plus 100, and the same thing for depth minus 1 and obj button. And then we're going to set its text trash button dot my text equals trash. So that will create the two buttons. We'll actually run it right now and make sure that we haven't made any mistakes. Press I, our inventory shows up, and here they are. And when I bring my mouse over them, it changes color. It looks really nice. You can tell that you're about to do something with it. Now, if I click on it, it's going to come up with an error because we haven't actually defined that script yet. So that's the next thing we're going to do here. So let's open up that script and jump into it. And just like when we added an item, there are a couple of cases we need to consider. Case 1. The first thing is if there is only one item in the inventory. If this is the case, we need to do something special, because otherwise it's going to create an error, because the way we're going to handle getting rid of an item is by setting it to 0 and then moving all of the other items down 1. And if we try and do that when there's only one item, that will not work. So case 2 is actually everything else. Now, the way we're going to be deleting is fairly complicated, and it's going to require a little bit of logical processing power. But there is an actual much simpler way of doing it, but I opted to not do that way because it's actually very confusing to the player when they are watching you delete an item. The very quick and easy way of deleting an item would be to first check if it's the only item, still need that, but then delete that item, pull the very last item and put it in its spot and then resize the grid by 1. If you do that, it's quick and easy and actually fairly simple to code, but it looks really weird because you might be deleting a book and replacing it with a yellow gem, and when the player does that, it won't make sense to them. So I opted to do a little more coding so that it makes more sense logically and visually for the player. Again, as the designer, you can do whatever you so desire, but I'm going to do it the more complicated way so you can understand and follow along with that if you so desire. So, the first case, what we're going to say is if ds grid height of player inventory is equal to 1. So if there is just one item in there, and if we say if ds grid get player inventory 1, and this is the amount, is greater than 1. And this is important because this is something that we're going to check. The way we are deleting an item is one at a time. Again, a design decision. But I'm going to say if we have 5 of something and we say trash, we actually are only trashing one of that item. If you take out this and this line of code that we're going to type right here, it will delete all of those items, and that may be what you want, but that isn't what I wanted to do. So we're going to say if there is more than one of that item that we are trying to get rid of, we are going to set player inventory slot 1, 0, because it's the very first item. And we're going to set it to ds grid get. So we're going to get that amount, and we're going to subtract 1 from it, which is what we're doing right here. So we're just going to decrease the amount by 1 if it is greater than 1. Now, if it's not, what we're going to do is for I equals 0, I is less than player inventory width plus I, ds grid set player inventory I, which is where it is 0, 0. Now this I is actually along the x-axis, whereas normally it's been along the y-axis. And we are setting it to a value of 0 because if it's the only item, we don't want to destroy our inventory. Now you could, and again, it's a design decision. And there are so many design decisions when it comes to the inventory. I'm making them one way and trying to explain why and how I'm coding them. But again, those are completely up to you as the programmer. You have total freedom as to how these things will work. I am not going to destroy my inventory. I'm going to leave it intact and just set it equal to zeros across the board. And we've set up over here in other inventory systems that if it is 0, it displays an empty message. So everything kind of works hand in hand like this. Now, let's move on to the second case. This one's a little more complicated. So we're going to say else, and that's because this is if right here and this is else. So else, and again, we're going to do the same thing basically right here that we did, except that it's going to be on the item selected. So we're going to say if ds grid get player inventory 1, item selected is greater than 1. So if they have more than one of that item that they have selected to get rid of, we're going to say ds grid set player inventory 1 of the item selected, ds grid get player inventory 1 item selected -1. So you've seen that. We're doing the exact same thing. Now, if that's not the case inside of here, I'm going to say else, and then this is where it gets a little more complicated. So I'm going to create 2 variables here. I'm going to call one current row. I'm going to set this equal to item selected +1. And I'm going to create another one called row to remove equal item selected. Now, I'm going to use a for loop, and what we're going to use these 2 rows for is going through and setting the current row, or setting the row to remove. We're going to set that to zeros. And then the row right above it, we're going to grab all of that information and shift it down 1. And we're going to do this all the way until we reach the end. That way it looks like everything just shifts up or down depending on how you phrase it. And things don't get out of order. They stay in the exact same order they were in. So if they were organized by name, they will still be organized by name after you delete this. So we're going to say for I equals row to remove. I is less than ds grid height of player inventory. And this is going to be -1 because we don't want to go beyond it this time. And we're going to say increase I by 1, and inside of this for loop is where the magic is going to happen. So we're going to use a new function called ds set grid region, and this allows us to set an entire row to one thing or another. So what we're actually going to do is copy one row to the other one, which is why we need to know both the current row and the row we want to copy. So we're going to set player inventory, and it's going to be player inventory again because you can copy it from another DS grid if you so desire, but we're not going to. It's going to be from the same DS grid to the same DS grid. So player inventory to player inventory, and the first X is going to be 0. The first Y is going to be current row, and then the second X is going to be 5. So from 0 to 5, all the way from left to right, we're going to grab all of the information about the item, and we're going to stick to our current row. And then we are going to put it on the X position of 0 and the Y position of I. And what that is going to do is take the row that is right above it, and then it's going to copy it into the row below it, effectively deleting the item that was there, which is fine because we don't want that item there anymore. Now we need to increase our current row every time we run this, and then we will eventually get to the very end and they will all be set, and we'll have one row at the very end that has 2 items in it. And then we want to do ds grid resize player inventory 5 ds grid height player inventory -1. So we are going to resize the grid by 1, deleting the very last item, which is actually a copy of the very last item. And when we delete an item, we need to make sure that we are no longer trying to select that item that was there. We're going to move our scrolled amount and our item selected down 1 so that it is now on what it should be instead of what it was there. Otherwise, you'll get an error trying to read something that isn't there, especially if you're on the very last item. It will cause an error if you don't have this. So we're going to say if scrolled amount is greater than 0, minus scrolled amount. If item selected is greater than 0, minus item selected. Now, before we can actually use this script, there are 2 things that we need to take care of. The first one is an obj inventory. When we get rid of our obj inventory GUI, we also need to destroy the buttons that we've created. So we're going to say repeat twice instance destroy obj button. Again, this is the difference between GameMaker Studio 1 and 2. If you're using 1, use a with statement right here, like up here. And then we need to come into the GUI, and we're going to add a step event, and we're going to do a couple of useful things right here. So in here we need to make it so that when we pick up items and when we are removing items, certain things will happen in a certain way. So we're going to say if ds grid get my items 0 and 0, if this doesn't equal 0, we are going to say is empty is equal to false. This will allow us to actually pick up items while our inventory is open. Inventory end at equals ds grid height my items, because we know that it was empty just a second ago, but it's not anymore. And we're going to say if dsGrid height my items is greater than or equal to, we're going to use this, the floor, they're going to get the size of our sprite again. So we probably should have made this a variable, but in hindsight, we didn't. We're going to subtract text border times 3, divide that by 32, and then if that's the case, we're going to say inventory end at equals the floor. Same thing here. Sprite height minus text border times 3 divided by 32. This will allow us to dynamically update our inventory even while it's open. Otherwise, it only ticks on the create event, so that's not as useful. Now, we also need to have this right here. If dsGrid get my items 0, 0 is equal to 0, which means that it is actually empty, we're going to say is empty equals true, and inventory end at equals 0. With those two things right there, now we can actually add inventory to our add items to our inventory while it's running, and now we should be able to use our script just the way we want it to. So I'm going to press trash, and it is going to delete all of these items. Let's come down here, and it gets rid of everything. We've got a lot of gold coins, but let's get rid of them. Delete the last one. We have no items. I'm going to pick that up. It shows up in our inventory right away. I can use this red berry, and then I can trash that, and I can close our inventory, and that allows us for a fully working inventory system. Now, there's just a few things left that I want to show you that are useful and make your inventory a little better and a little more usable in game. So the first one is going to be a scroll bar, and we're actually going to add that down here at the bottom of our draw event, and we're just going to draw a sprite, and that's about it. And we're going to just tell it to draw in the correct spot as we are using it. It's not actually too difficult. So we're just going to say if dsGrid height of my items is greater than, here's this again, basically the size of the sprite we're using right now. Really should have made this a variable. We're going to draw sprite SPR scroll bar 0 for subimage. Now we're going to draw this only when we have more items than the size of our sprite. So it'll disappear as soon as we can no longer scroll. So it's a visual indicator to your player that you have more items in your inventory. The X spot is BB box right, and then the Y is what's tricky. So we need to bring it in by 20. We're going to put it at the top. We're going to plus item selected times, and this is going to be where we do some math to make sure that it scrolls the width or the height of our sprite no matter how many items there are in our inventory. So if we had 100 items, we would want it to scroll just a tiny little bit every single time. But if we had only 2 items beyond our inventory slot, we'd want it to scroll the entire height in those 2 scrolls. So we're going to multiply this by sprite height minus text border, and we're going to divide that by dsGrid height of my items. And when we do that and we run it, our scroll bar will appear, and it will allow us to scroll and look awesome like that. And then as soon as we no longer need it, it disappears. Perfect. So that's one very useful thing. Another very useful thing is to be able to order your inventory by different means. So we are going to create another object over here, and this is going to be obj, we'll call it obj order, and we are going to give it a sprite of clickable, but we're not actually going to want this to appear. I was using this sprite for debugging purposes to get it in the right spot. So I'll make it visible for now just to show you where it's actually going to cover. So it's going to cover up the column name of item and amount. And with that, we're going to be able to click on those two things, and then it will order it by that thing that we are clicking on. So we're going to pass in what we want it to be ordered by, and we're going to set up a return value that is also undefined right now. And when we mouse left pressed, we are just going to call a script. But we're going to call a script in a way that allows us to order it by ascending and descending. If we keep on clicking, it'll change. So we're going to say if return value is equal to true, we're going to give return value the value of sort inventory. It is a function that we are going to create in just a second. It's a script we have to make. We're going to pass in player inventory, my ordered by, and it's going to be true the first time we use it. And then after that, so if this is true, it's going to do that. Otherwise, it's going to do this exact same thing, but it's going to pass in false. And then we're going to create a script, and we're going to call this sort inventory. And this script is actually fairly simple. Let me show you what it is by copying and pasting the comments so that you can see that. And then we're going to say grid to sort equals argument 0, sort by equals argument 1, and order equals argument 2. Now, when we do this, all we have to do is use a built-in function that says ds grid sort. And then you choose which column to sort by, and it will sort them for you. So we're going to say grid sort, sort by, and order. Now, the order is the true or false. That is going to change because we're going to say return the opposite of what it was sent. Now, when we use this function as a design decision, I'm going to say we go to the very top of our inventory. That way, when you order it, you are at the top, whether by name or amount or whatever. But again, that's my design decision. If you don't want that, take out this code right there. So this function is very useful. And now all we have to do is go into the GUI, go into the alarm event, because that's where we want to create them, because we want to do it based off of the sprite information. And we are going to say, down here, name click equals instance create depth. Again, difference between GameMaker Studio 1 and 2. Hopefully you've picked that up by now. Sprite get x offset. Let me bring this over. Of sprite index bbox top plus 30 depth minus 1 and what is that? Obj, what do we name it? Order. Okay, and we're going to say nameClick.my ordered by equals 0 because this is for naming. This is for ordering it by the name, which is in the x-axis of 0. And this is going to be amount click, pretty much the same thing, just a little bit over. So it's going to be bbox right minus 50, bbox top plus 30, depth minus 1, obj inventory clickable. Sorry, that's what I had before. Obj order, and then amount click dot my ordered by equals 1. And then we're going to come up to obj inventory, and before we forget, we're going to destroy those two when we get rid of our inventory as well. Instance destroy obj order. And so when we run it, they will appear right over those names. And now we can order them by name, order them by amount, and we can keep clicking on that and it will change it as we go along. And our red berries right here, you can see that it adds to it. And if we're now, when you pick things up, they're not sorted automatically. So something you could do if you wanted to, a design decision, is call sort by name or sort by the last sorted value every time you pick up a new item. That way it's exactly where you expect it to be. But that's totally up to you and how you want your inventory to function. So that's it. That is an entire inventory system for you. Now, I showed this off in the introduction, but if you didn't see it, this is really cool. The way we've coded this is that our sprite can be resized depending on the height that you want, and it will still work exactly the way you want it to. Because we have used sprite index, we've used the B box left and top, we have used the sprite built-in variables so that no matter where we place things, no matter how tall this is, it's going to fit properly because we've used all of those built-in variables and variables that we have made ourselves. So let's mark this as no longer visible and call that a day. So that is an inventory system for you. I hope that you have enjoyed it. It has been a pleasure teaching you and showing this off to you. This is something that I'll be using in my game, so I thought I would share it with all of you. If you've enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and share it around. I put a lot of work into this, and I would love for more people to see it. If you have questions or comments or you'd like to support me, check out my Patreon. I would love to hear from you and work with you if that's something that you would like to do. But that's all. So, as always, have fun making great games, and I will talk to you later. If you find the content on my channel useful and you like it, consider supporting me on Patreon. All of the people on the screen are doing so, and they are awesome, and they get rewards, and you can join them. So, thank you for your time, and have a wonderful day.